think that the power of an argument rests in the nature of the objection. Okay? That the power of an argument rests on the nature of the objection. So if somebody is objecting to the resurrection, then an argument for God's existence is probably not where we need to be. Because it's just whether or not that they say, yeah, there is a God, but the issue is, did Jesus really rise from the dead? So what I'm saying is that an argument must always be matched up with the objection. And theistic arguments seem to gain more traction within the larger apologetic endeavor, depending on the nature of the questions that are being asked, which can be translated into what is the objection. In other words, what kind of questions are people asking? So we have people here, you know, Sweden, Norway, Sweden, I thought so. So, you know, the same questions may not be forefront in Sweden or Norway as they might be in the United States. So, first of all, we have to be, as Christians, apologists, we have to be sensitive to the environment in which we are doing our work and know, well, what are the major objections? Now, I think that it may be the case that the objections today, generally speaking, no matter where you are, is what difference does it make whether God is there or not? Now, I know we've had some of the rather pugnacious atheists who are often referred to as the four horsemen, people like, not so much Richard Dawkins, though he certainly does seem, I think he's much milder, but Hitchens, Sam Harris, they would be names known to most of us, really seem to be very pugnacious, wanted to fight, really angry about Christianity, and think that anybody that believes in God are really stupid. But I'm going to say that the average person on the street does not share that view. The view they share is, so what difference does it make? What if God is there if he's not there? So, as a matter of fact, the last lecture that I do here is, why is it people aren't listening to us? And I'm wondering, in part, if it's not that we're simply not addressing the issues that they're raising. I think that if we put too much emphasis on theistic arguments, so let me say at the beginning, I'm not suggesting in any way that theistic arguments have no place, right? I think they do. However, as we said in the last lecture, the average person in the pew simply does not feel that they're going to be able to do this, particularly if the argument is more scientific. The Kalam argument, irreducible complexity. Even the moral argument, some may find more complicated. So in this case, if we put too much emphasis on theistic arguments, I think this does tend to lead to a rather thin and impersonal notion of God. Not on the part of the apologist, but on the part of those who are listening. It's as if God is an object, an abstract metaphysical object that we're going to defend. Well, he's an object, of course, but he's also a person, he's a subject. I think it regenerates, too much emphasis, generates on rather what I'd call a reductionistic view of Christianity that's devoid of true mystery and worship. It makes God the object to be studied, not the person to be known and worshipped. Now, they would go together, but if all we're doing are theistic arguments, I think they sometimes divorce this notion that God is a person, he is one to be known in relationship, that he is one to be known to be worshipped. So if we think about how would we talk about somebody in our family or somebody that we loved, and they say, well, tell me about this person, we probably wouldn't give some sort of, well, so-and-so is such a height, such and such. We give these objective physical measurements. Roger Scruton, though you've heard me now, his name comes up so many times, I think it warns us that of this matter, and I think Lewis does as well. So what we have to concern ourselves with is what I'm going to talk about, is what I'll say is the plausibility of God. Is God even a plausible factor in the equation? And if so, what difference does it make? Now, it's very interesting that that question is very much on the mind and tongue of the average person on the street. So what difference does it make? Now, that might cause us as evangelicals to ask a very serious question. Is it the fact that the relevance of God in community and personal life is so dimmed in the church today that the world can't see the plausibility or the value, I should say the value, but the power of God in our lives? I think arguments are necessary, don't misunderstand me, and I think we need to present God, on the other hand, though, as a person, as a subject with whom you and I can enter into a meaningful relationship where the finite, if I might say it, participates with the infinite. I think there is something to be said for that. So, what does it matter? If beliefs reflect reality, of course they are of enormous importance, aren't they? If they reflect reality. It makes a difference if I hear a noise behind me and I say, oh, it's just the wind. Or if the noise behind me is a man-eating tiger. It does make a difference, doesn't it? About what I believe about the state of reality. So if it's just the wind, then I can stand there and enjoy the breeze. If it's a man-eating tiger, well, now you see, it's altogether different. If all there is matter, then there's little to worry about outside of science. I mean, that's just the way it would have to be. But as we've discussed here this morning, there is something that's intuitive that bubbles up inside of us that seems to lead to the notion that there isn't just the material, that there's something beyond this. So I'm going to suggest that the personal dimension must not be lost in our doing argumentation. I'm reminded of Lewis. I don't know how many of you have been reading Lewis, but have The Great Divorce. If you haven't read The Great Divorce, it's a great read, and you ought to read The Great Divorce. But in The Great Divorce, if you might remember that there is this scene where there's the ghost and there's the spirit, and the ghost, the ghosts have come up to talk to the spirit to find out about this thing about heaven. Do they want to come in or not? And so the spirit, which is, in the sense, the good guy, and the ghost is the one who's just come up from another place, and they're talking about art. And so the spirit is talking to the ghost, and the ghost says, oh boy, you haven't seen my recent work. I'm so great. I've done such a wonderful job with my art. And Lewis, the spirit says, one does indeed. I also had to recover from it. That is, this idea that what I'm doing is I just love what I do, rather than for what it is saying. It was all a snare, the spirit says. Ink and catgut and paint were necessary down there, but they're also dangerous stimulants. Every poet and musician and artist, but for grace, is drawn away from the love of the thing he tells to the love of the telling. And I think that's a danger for so many of us, that we just get loving doing apologetics rather than loving the God of whom we are speaking. That can be true in music, that can be true in the preacher, it can be true all the way down the line. And then the Spirit goes on to say, yes, now they just love the telling. They like to hear their own voice, like to see their own work. And Lewis says, until deep down in deep hell, they cannot be interested in God at all, but only in what they say about him. For it doesn't stop at being interested in the paint, they sink lower and become interested in their own personalities and then in nothing but their own reputations. there's a danger that faces us as apologists, that we don't fall into that trap where we're trying to one-up somebody else. We got a better programmer. We got a such and so forth. So we need to be careful about that. So the question is, what difference does it make? If God is there, what difference does it make? If He's not there, what difference would it make? If it's just the wind, it's one thing. If it's a man-eating tiger, it's quite another thing. So I think that, as we've discussed earlier, this question of significance and meaning, we're longing for that sense, and as we said earlier, this men without faces, this dehumanizing of our society is having a serious impact, and people do search for significance. They are looking for meaning, as I think I may have said here at one point. The studies are showing now that this idea of internet and Facebook and social media is not giving people a greater sense of humanity. It's actually dehumanizing. They don't have a greater sense of being connected. They actually have a sense of isolation and almost depression. In the city where I live, once or twice a month, and we have a nice large park that's managed by the city, and I think it's twice a month, they have a weekend which is called Unplug, in which they encourage the families to come to the park, leave the computers at home, leave social media behind, and just come to the park and enjoy one another as human beings. Well, I think that's a great idea, and it surprises me that it's the secular world that's thinking of doing something like that. But I think they recognize what's going on. Surely God must be presented in the world. If we're to have faith in Him, we have to know who we are. For faith is a personal relationship. It's a relationship of trust that demands a kind of mutuality that one can freely be offered to another in a sort of the world of space. Now, if the belief in God, this is a quote from Scruton, Roger Scruton. He says, now if the belief in God were nothing more than a piece of abstract metaphysics, it's hard to see that it would matter whether we believe or disbelieve. That's so. That's all He is. God is not a hypothesis to be set aside, to be set beside the fundamental constants and the laws of quantum dynamics. Look for Him in a world of objects and you will not find Him, just as you will not find human freedom in a brain scan or the self with a microscope. See, the question is not just can we demonstrate that God is there, but who is He and how do we enter into this relationship? Has He spoken, and is there any possibility of personal relationship? Is it possible for us to make sense of the world in a personal way? And I think here is very much a question for us to think about: what is the role of theistic arguments? I think they're limited. I think they work very well in some places. They don't work so well in other places. But what we have to demonstrate, theistic arguments do not necessarily demonstrate that beliefs matter. Lifestyle based on beliefs do. So I'm going to look at this notion, do beliefs matter? I've argued elsewhere that people tend not to take beliefs seriously today. It does not matter much because everything has been leveled. Because of pluralism and toleration, one belief does not stand above another belief anymore. We have the loss of the transcendent, which leads to the loss of the sacred, which leads to a total disordering of society. That one belief doesn't stand above another. Well, if that's true, if your belief is as good as my belief, if that's true, then why are we trying to make a case for my belief in God? Because, in fact, it doesn't make any difference. Unless There is something about the community that professes faith in that God, that lives differently than what I would call the parent culture. This is why life, more than anything, speaks to the matter of why beliefs do matter. Now, so what I'm not going to argue for is an either-or, that is, theistic arguments, life of community. I'm going to argue for both and. Christianity answers the questions of humanity that humanity asks in every single generation. And the truth of Christianity remains regardless how a Christian lives. So I just want to make that clear. Christianity does not depend upon how Christians live. That is the truth of it. However, but the world first judges its truthfulness by its power to inform man on how to live rightly. The legitimacy of our message is often determined, and I said the legitimacy, okay? And not the truthfulness, but the legitimacy of our message is often determined, at least in the eyes of the world, by the efficacy of its evidence in our lives, both individually and collectively. It's interesting when you read Tertullian. Tertullian says, well, it was Christians that finally, the way they lived, that finally led him to faith in Christ. He didn't say it was a Christian, though that may have been true. It's Christians as a whole, okay, as a community. For the Christian, apologetics is not just a theoretical game by which we can push people around mentally. That's quite easy to do. It's a search for truth within the context of some revelation from God. In the end, it is a matter of truth and error, of life and death. So we need to emphasize, or I'm going to emphasize the need of community. And Richard Weaver said in 1949 that ideas have consequences. James Hunter said a few years ago in his book To Change the World, yes, ideas do have consequences, but they have greatest consequences when they are embedded in an institution. So why is naturalism so powerful today in our cultures? Because it has been embedded in institutions. Well, you might not like the language per se, but that I think the truth of Christ needs to be embedded in the church, what we call incarnation. Since my time has rather run out, let me just say then, as in apologetically, how then, I think what I've said, community is really important. I'm not arguing either or, theistic arguments or community. I'm arguing for both, that is what we call a both and, because I think theistic arguments have a limitation. They have a role, they tell us who it is that we are to believe in, but it is community, the community of faith, that says this is why it's important. This is how it changes relationships. This is how it orders a person's life. We live in a disordered world, and the church ought to be the place where we see order in everyday life. So I think for us, we could talk a little bit about how that works out, but I think I'll just leave it at that because of our time. So I want to reemphasize, I'm not arguing that we toss theistic arguments out. I just think that just the arguments alone, and that's where we're often seen as apologists. It leads to a very, very thin and a very, should I say, kind of static a view of God. So we need to know how it is that these things work out. Why is it they matter? And that's why I would argue that apologetics ought to become a part of a local church and not just a few hired guns that go around doing apologetics, though there's certainly a place for that.